The room was quiet in a way that felt heavier than despair, because despair at least still carries motion, still argues, still resists, while this silence had already accepted that nothing more could be done, that nothing more would be said, and that whatever remained would have to exist without explanation. The doctors had left earlier, their voices careful, their words precise, offering clarity instead of hope, because hope no longer fit the situation, and the night stretched forward without interruption, without expectation, without the illusion that morning would bring change. A woman lay still, her breathing shallow but steady, surrounded not by urgency, not by plans, but by waiting, the kind of waiting that follows surrender rather than struggle, when effort has ended and only presence remains. Someone whispered a prayer, not because they believed it would change anything, but because silence felt unbearable without it. And when the prayer faded, nothing followed, except faith. By the time she arrived in Lourdes, she was no longer searching for healing in the way people usually understand it, because months of illness had already reshaped her expectations, narrowing them slowly, patiently, until what once felt essential had been replaced by something quieter and more fragile. Doctors had spoken clearly, offering diagnoses that carried no uncertainty, outlining treatments that promised management rather than recovery, and explaining limits without cruelty, yet with a finality that left little room for interpretation. She listened carefully. She always had. She followed instructions, endured procedures, and accepted each new adjustment with discipline and grace. But as time passed, and her body continued to weaken, it became clear that medicine was no longer moving her forward, only holding her in place. The journey to Lourdes was not planned as a final attempt, nor as a dramatic act of faith meant to force an outcome, but rather as a quiet decision shaped by exhaustion, by the desire to be somewhere that did not revolve around charts, schedules, or prognosis. She did not travel alone. Family members accompanied her, carrying concern they no longer knew how to voice, watching her movements slow, her strength diminish, aware that they were witnessing something that felt irreversible. At Lourdes, everything moved differently. Time slowed, voices softened, people waited without urgency. There were no promises made to her, no guarantees offered. Only the presence of others who had arrived carrying the same quiet weight, each one standing at the edge of something they could not name. That night, as she lay resting, far from home and far from certainty, faith was no longer something she reached for. It was simply all that remained. Lourdes had long been known as a place where suffering gathered quietly, not because it promised certainty, but because it allowed space for those who had reached the edges of explanation. A place shaped by stories of healing and doubt, existing side by side, neither canceling the other, both lingering in the same air. She knew the history, at least in broad strokes, not as doctrine or obligation, but as something that had lived on the periphery of her life for years. Stories heard but never claimed. Accounts of recovery that had always belonged to other people, other circumstances, other lives. Her own illness had begun gradually, almost politely, with symptoms that could be explained, managed, and postponed, until it could no longer be contained within routines, until it demanded attention and altered the shape of her days, forcing her to let go of work, of plans, of the version of herself she had assumed would continue unchanged. Specialists had been consulted, tests repeated, treatments refined. Each step brought clarity without relief, understanding without resolution, until the future narrowed into something predictable and heavy, a path that could be described but not avoided. It was not despair that brought her to Lourdes, but resignation, the quiet acceptance that she was now living within limits she did not choose, and that if anything remained to be encountered beyond those limits, it would not be found in another appointment or another adjustment of medication. The decision to travel was made without ceremony, discussed gently among family members who understood that this journey was not about outcome, but about meaning, about placing what remained of her strength in a space where she did not need to explain herself or defend her hope. When she arrived, she was struck not by spectacle, but by simplicity, by the sight of people moving slowly, carefully, many of them marked by illness or age, all of them carrying something unfinished, all of them waiting without demanding. There were no guarantees offered, no declarations made, only presence. And in that presence, her story joined countless others, not as a claim, but as a question still unfolding. By the time she reached that night in Lourdes, the struggle itself had grown quiet, not because it had been resolved, but because it had exhausted every available path, leaving behind a stillness shaped by acceptance rather than hope, by the understanding that nothing more could be demanded of the body without asking too much. Her doctors had been honest. They had explained what could be expected and what could not, outlining the limits of treatment with care and restraint, never removing dignity from the conversation, yet never offering illusions that might soften what was coming. There would be no new procedures, no alternative therapies, no next step waiting beyond the ones already taken. What remained was management, comfort, and time, measured carefully, quietly, without urgency, because urgency no longer belonged to her situation. The body had reached its threshold, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, in the way things often do when decline is patient and unremarkable, each small loss barely noticeable on its own, yet unmistakable when viewed together. She felt it in the effort required to move, in the way her strength faded sooner each day, in the growing dependence on others for tasks that once required no thought at all. And with that dependence came a quiet grief, not for what had already been lost, but for what would soon follow. That night, there was no expectation of change, no silent bargaining, no final plea. She lay still, her breathing shallow but steady, aware that whatever remained of her life would unfold within the boundaries already defined, and that faith, if it meant anything now, could no longer be asked to produce results. It could only remain. This was the point where human effort ends, not in defeat, but in honesty, when nothing more can be added without pretending, and the future, however uncertain, must be faced without conditions. And so the night deepened, carrying with it no promise of healing, only the quiet acknowledgement that everything possible had already been done. Nothing happened all at once, and if someone had been watching closely, searching for a clear instant where the night divided itself into before and after, they would not have found it, because whatever began to change did so, without permission and without urgency, unfolding quietly within the same stillness that had already settled over her. She had been resting, her body heavy with fatigue, her thoughts drifting in and out of awareness, when a subtle shift occurred, not dramatic enough to wake the room, yet distinct enough to disturb the rhythm she had grown accustomed to. A sensation not of pain leaving, but of something loosening, as though a weight she had carried for so long had been gently set aside. Her breathing deepened, not suddenly, not forcefully, but naturally, as if the body were remembering a pattern it had forgotten how to hold. And with each slow breath, tension receded, replaced by a quiet warmth that moved through her chest and limbs without explanation. She opened her eyes. The room looked the same. The night had not changed. And yet, something within her had. There was no voice she could hear, no vision to interpret, no moment she could point to and name, only the unmistakable awareness that what had been constant for so long was no longer present, that the boundaries she had accepted were no longer holding her in place. She sat up slowly, more out of instinct than intention, waiting for the familiar resistance to return, but it did not, and as she moved, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, strength met her where weakness had always been. Those nearby noticed the change not through declaration, but through movement, through posture, through the simple and startling fact that she was doing what she had not been able to do before, without assistance, without effort, without fear. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt the moment by defining it too quickly. They watched, silent and uncertain, as the night that had been shaped by limits quietly gave way to something entirely unaccounted for. And faith, which had remained without expectation, found itself standing in the presence of an answer it had not demanded. At first, those around her hesitated to respond, not out of disbelief alone, but because sudden movement felt inappropriate in the presence of something so fragile and undefined, as though any rush to name what was happening might cause it to retreat, returning the night to the limits it had already accepted. She remained sitting, calm and steady, testing her movements slowly, deliberately, as if reacquainting herself with a body she no longer fully recognized, lifting her hands, shifting her weight, standing with care, each action confirming what words could not yet safely express. Family members watched closely, their concern giving way to something quieter and far more unsettling, because concern had been familiar territory, something they had learned to inhabit, while this new reality offered no map, no guidance on how to respond when what had been expected no longer applied. There were no cries of celebration, no sudden declarations of certainty, only questions forming silently in each mind, held back by a shared instinct to wait, to allow the moment to unfold without interference, without interpretation imposed too quickly. Others nearby began to notice. A posture once bent was now upright. Movements once cautious were now fluid. The effort that had defined every step was absent, replaced by ease that felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Someone reached out to steady her, then stopped, realizing assistance was no longer required. And that simple realization carried more weight than any spoken affirmation could have. The atmosphere shifted subtly, the way it does when reality rearranges itself quietly, without asking permission, and those present felt themselves standing between what had been true only hours earlier and what was now unfolding before them. No one rushed to conclusions. They remained there together, bound by silence, allowing the aftermath to take shape slowly, aware that whatever had happened did not belong to haste, but to careful witnessing. And in that stillness, the night continued, no longer defined by limits, but by the uneasy and undeniable presence of change. Morning arrived without announcement, as mornings always do, and yet it carried with it a difference that could not be ignored, because the woman who woke that day did so with a body that no longer behaved according to the limits it had enforced for so long, moving with an ease that felt unfamiliar, almost cautious, as if she were waiting for resistance to return. It did not. She walked slowly at first, testing each step, not in disbelief, but in attentiveness, listening closely to sensations that had once been dominated by pain or weakness, and now spoke a different language altogether, one of balance, strength, and presence. Those who accompanied her noticed the change not through declarations or explanations, but through absence, the absence of strain, the absence of hesitation, the absence of the quiet suffering that had shaped every moment of the journey until then. Later that day, and in the days that followed, the change remained, not partially, not inconsistently, but fully. Medical examinations were requested, not out of skepticism alone, but out of responsibility, because what had occurred demanded careful attention, and when results came back, they confirmed what observation had already suggested. The condition that had defined her life for so long was no longer present. Doctors reviewed records, compared timelines, examined reports, and spoke cautiously, choosing language that reflected honesty rather than certainty, acknowledging improvement without claiming understanding, because what had happened did not fit within expected progression or explanation. For the woman herself, the impact unfolded more slowly, not in the body, but in the mind, as she began to realize that the future she had already accepted was no longer waiting for her, and that this return to health carried with it questions she had never expected to face. Faith, which had remained quietly beside her without expectation, now occupied a different place, not louder or more certain, but deeper, reshaped by an experience that had not asked for belief, but had met it in silence. Life resumed, but it did so altered, marked by an awareness that remained present in ordinary moments, a recognition that some nights do not end when morning comes, but continue quietly within the lives they have changed. There are nights that do not demand attention while they are happening, nights that unfold quietly, without urgency or announcement, because nothing within them appears extraordinary at first glance. And yet those same nights continue to echo long after they have passed, reshaping the way life is understood by those who lived through them. That night in Lourdes was one of those. Nothing about it began with certainty or expectation, because certainty had already been exhausted, stripped away by months of illness, by careful explanations, by limits clearly defined and patiently accepted, leaving behind a kind of faith that no longer asked for outcomes, only for meaning. When faith becomes all that remains, it changes form. It no longer argues. It no longer negotiates. It no longer measures itself by results. It simply stays. Perhaps that is why what happened that night cannot be approached as a transaction, as though healing were a reward or a response to effort, because nothing in that moment resembled bargaining or demand, and nothing in her posture suggested anticipation of change. She was not waiting to be healed. She was resting within the boundaries she had already accepted. And yet, within that acceptance, something shifted, not loudly, not visibly, not in a way that could be traced back to a precise second or cause. The mystery of Lourdes has always lived in that space between devotion and doubt, between testimony and scrutiny, a place where stories are neither forced into belief nor dismissed as illusion, but allowed to stand under careful observation, subjected to time, examination, and restraint. Her story would follow the same path. Medical records were reviewed, statements gathered, timelines examined, not to prove, but to understand. And even when understanding remained incomplete, the facts themselves resisted dismissal, because what had been present was no longer present, and what had been lost had quietly returned. For her, the meaning unfolded gradually, not as revelation, but as responsibility, because when life is returned after being surrendered, it is not received lightly, and gratitude does not arrive as celebration, but as attentiveness, as a renewed awareness of fragility and time. She spoke carefully afterward, not with certainty, not with instruction, but with honesty. She did not claim to understand why this happened to her and not to others, nor did she frame her healing as a statement about faith itself, because Lourdes does not exist to answer questions, only to hold them. What remained with her was not the desire to convince, but the quiet obligation to live differently, to treat ordinary moments with the reverence once reserved for crisis, to remember that life is not promised according to logic or fairness, but received moment by moment, often without explanation. And perhaps that is the deeper truth carried by nights like this one, not that healing occurs, but that surrender does not equal absence, that when effort ends and expectation falls away, presence still remains, steady and unassuming. Lourdes has seen countless nights like this, some ending in recovery, many ending in silence, all ending in waiting. Not every story leaves with visible change, but every story leaves marked, because faith in its quietest form does not promise outcomes. It offers companionship within uncertainty. And so this story rests where it belongs, not as proof to be displayed or certainty to be defended, but as a witness to a moment when nothing was demanded, nothing was forced, and nothing was explained, yet something undeniable took place. The night passed, as all nights do. Morning came, as it always does. But what remained was not simply a healed body, but a life reshaped by the understanding that when faith is all that remains, it is sometimes enough not to guarantee change, but to receive it when it arrives unannounced. And perhaps that is the only conclusion this story was ever meant to offer.